On the hour here well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I won't say this afternoon because I think with people from various time zones coming to listen in, and it's a pleasure to have with us Tashanna Walker. My name's David Howard. I'm co-director of the Global Centre of Healthcare and Urbanisation and an associate professor in sustainable urban development here at the University of Oxford. And we've scheduled an hour's seminar. We're very happy to run over if questions are flowing on the hour, but it's a great pleasure to have with us today on screen Dr. Tashanna Walker, who is is a visiting researcher here at the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation, as also a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, gained a PhD at Rutgers University, and will be taking up a post at City College, City University of New York in the fall, I expect. Was that right? In a few months. So thank you. And you'll be speaking on your research that you've carried out in Kingston, Jamaica. So thank you very much for offering your knowledge and time this afternoon. And we have two excellent discussants. Professor Rivka Jaffa, who's the Professor of Urban Geography at University of Amsterdam. Rivka has spent many years successfully doing research in Jamaica, but also Curacao, and recently has extended that comparative analysis, I think, looking at aspects of policing, militarization, urban inequalities in Latin America, South America as well, and has published a book, excellent book, which I'm halfway through, called The Rule of Dons. So thank you for joining us today, Rivka from Kingston. And we also have Dr. Alex Moulton, who's an assistant professor at Hunter College. He specializes in research in Black geographies, Black ecologies, political ecology of climate change, and the landscape legacies of colonialism. So thank you, Alex, again for joining us today. In the US and in the UK, it's a public holiday, so apologies for those who are now working on a public holiday. But thank you so much for your time. We have scheduled an hour, as I say, so Tashanna will speak for about 30 minutes on the title of her research on a seminar paper, which is Militarized Urbanism and Politics of Security, Impacts in Kingston, Jamaica. And then Rivka and Alex will both have a 5 minutes discussion just to consider Tashanna's research. So I've been really looking forward to this. And as I said, we'll aim to finish the main discussion, etc., within the hour. But if those in the audience who want to send questions in the chat, then I will relay those to Tashanna at the end of the seminar so we can discuss those. So less of me, more of Tashanna. Over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Before I begin, I must apologize if there is some kind of feedback in the background. There's some work happening outside. Don't know why they choose to work on Memorial Day, but if you hear anything, it's just a large crane. So yes, thanks, David, for that introduction. And thanks to the GCHU for hosting this seminar, and Jesse for all your hard work, and to the discussants for your contributions to come. So I'll start by sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation. Yes. So as David mentioned, my talk today will be on militarized urbanism and the politics of security in Jamaica. I'll be paying keen attention to the effects of militarization on marginalized communities and the people that live within. So this research is informed by my doctoral dissertation, which entailed 12 months of ethnographic research in Kingston, particularly in Trench Town, which is the primary field site for this project. And to understand the current climate of urban militarization or militarized urbanism in Kingston, Jamaica, it is imperative to understand Kingston's evolving urban form within the context of decades of redevelopment projects that arguably failed to maximize their potential, as well as a landscape that is plagued by persistent crime and violence, fueled particularly by the political wars of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, as well as inter and intra-gang violence that occurred afterwards. And this inter and intra-gang violence was arguably, or partially rather, a product of a fight for territory due to the guns for drugs trade between the United States, Jamaica, Haiti, and South America. So with that context in mind, let's begin. So in the early emancipation era of the 1800s, up towards the 1960s, which is the independence era in Jamaica, there was sustained rural to urban migration, with many migrants leaving essentially everything behind in rural areas to move to Kingston in search of economic opportunities. This is extensively written about in the literature. David, for example, has written on this kind of stuff. However, the pace of migration from rural Jamaica to urban Kingston outweighed the pace of infrastructural development. And so the housing stock was not enough to account for the inflow of people that moved to Kingston in search of opportunities. This resulted in a large amount of people settling on empty lands, which would become known as shanty towns, ghettos, or slum areas. David Dodman writes about how these areas suffered from overcrowding, extreme poverty, as well as violence. So while the government of Jamaica focused on infrastructural development along its waterfront and its port facilities in Kingston, these slum areas remain largely neglected for decades. However, it is within these urban enclaves of informality that you see Jamaica's rich cultural heritage emerging. And communities like Trench Town, which is the primary field site of this project, would become known as the birthplace of reggae music and home to icons such as Bob Marley. However, as these communities' cultural influence grew, so did the violence and economic insecurity in these spaces, as well as informal hierarchies of power and governance that was headed by a central figure called a Don, which I'm sure Rivka will touch on in her response. So these Dons would establish codes of conduct for each of the respective neighborhoods that they inhabit or govern, and would serve as a kind of mediator for conflict and often the executor of punishment. And importantly, these Dons and the spaces that they govern were operated exclusively outside the formal judicial system. However, as the political figures across the both political parties in Jamaica, that is the People's National Party and the Jamaica Labour Party, began to recognize and eventually legitimize the power of the Dons, they would use them for their political bidding. This would include forcing residents to vote for a particular party, even against their will, in exchange for housing opportunities, job opportunities, etc. Furthermore, as the power of the Dons grew, so did their relationships with the political figures, so did their autonomy, as well as their resources through participation in the guns for drugs trade between the US, Jamaica, South America. Ultimately, what happened was there's a bloody power struggle that ensued between warring fractions between the various Dons, as well as with the politicians and these Dons. But this power struggle had various motivations over the years. In the 70s, 60s, 80s, they would fight with each other over territory and votes in exchange for political patronage. However, by the 1990s onwards, the clash would be over territory and control of port facilities, gun flows, drug trade routes, etc. As the intra-gang violence intensified, the state struggled to take control of these urban enclaves that were under the rule of Dons. These enclaves would come to be known as garrisons, as coined by Carl Stone. As the violence that emanated from these garrisons kind of spilled over into the central business district of Kingston, and these various economic zones, then it really became an issue as the government saw it as a hindrance to further economic development, infrastructure, international investment, as well as the tourism potential of Kingston. And to deal with this problem, the state would routinely use curfews, extrajudicial killings, um, community policing, and certain other tactics to contain criminality within these communities. However, it was not until about 2010, with the extradition of a central Don, which is known as Christopher Dodos Coke, that the state would get an opportunity to reassert itself into these impenetrable garrisons. So this operation or this extradition was conducted under what scholars have called or what popular media as well as scholars have called the Tivoli incursion. And why is this incursion so important? So Dodos, which is the central Don, was said to be the leader of the most impenetrable garrison, that is Tivoli Gardens. And this particular garrison operated completely outside the formal state, even having its own prison. And here the state had no power over the citizenry. And so with the removal of Coke using this extradition request, the state essentially signaled to the rest of Jamaica as well as the international community that the reign of dance is now ended, and the state is now able to take control of these spaces that were seen as a threat to democracy. And so with the removal of Coke and the reinstitution of the state into these spaces, we see a proliferation of various mechanisms of urban militarization with the goal of reasserting state power within these communities that were outside their reach for so many years. And there are three primary mechanisms used to establish militarized power in these communities. That is the using states of emergencies, the Zones of Special Operations Act, or enhanced security measures. And the Zones of Special Operations Act in particular came on stream in 2017, and it is inspired by counterinsurgency theory and is built on the mantra of clear, hold, and build. And what does clear, hold, and build mean? It means that the Jamaica Defense Force, as well as the Jamaica Constabulary Force, would occupy a delineated area and occupy the ground for 60 consecutive days, conducting conducting foot patrols, checkpoints, detentions, and so on, responding to flare-ups in violence. And once these areas are clear of criminal elements and the soldiers or security forces have held the ground for an extended amount of time, then social services would come in to provide people in the community with social capitals to improve their social and economic conditions. So but despite the legal jargon under which this military operation occurs, the mode of operation pretty much looks the same, whether it is a zones of special operations or it's just experiencing enhanced security measures or a state of emergency. And what does this actual militarization look like? So it would include communities being flooded with security officers from the Jamaica Defense Force and the Jamaica Constabulary Force, setting up checkpoints, and these checkpoints would have barriers where vehicles would stop as they approach. Vehicles would be searched, persons could be detained at this point, or their personal belongings taken. Residents also face detention while in these communities while it is under militarization. So they would be taken into a military vehicle, such as a truck or jeep or whatever, and taken to a temporary checkpoint, not checkpoint, sorry, holding facility where they would be processed. So what that would include taking their biometrics, their fingerprint addresses, and so on. And once processed, they would be released if there's not a warrant or something out for their arrest. Communities would be experiencing frequent foot patrols, as you'd see in the photograph on figure 7. That is just a military convoy on foot patrol. There would be constant curfews, starting as early as 6 o'clock or 8 p.m., and even earlier if there's a shooting in the area. There would also be excessive punishment, which would include severe beatings or extrajudicial killings in extreme cases. There would also be heavy restrictions on social gatherings, including funerals, birthdays, and so on, as security officers would regulate what kind of music is played, for how long, how many persons could attend, what venues could be used, what time frames the event could occur, etc. So as we see this transposition of penitentiary-like tactics onto the garrison, whereby persons are physically and ontologically sequestered in their homes, we kind of begin to see the idea of the prison move beyond the physical walls of the General Penitentiary of Kingston or Kingston's Penitentiary onto neighborhoods like Trench Town, which are seen as dispensable. And it's important to note that the prison facilities in Jamaica are extremely outdated or and unable to house the perpetrators that are captured by the security forces. And so we see, this makeshift or invisible prison being constructed around communities that are, been neglected over the years and are seen as dispensable. But importantly, there has been a recent development happening in politics in Jamaica, or in the political scene, where earlier this month, the People's National Party, who has been staunchly against the militarization of urban neighborhoods, won a landmark case against the Jamaica Labour Party, in which they brought the Jamaica Labour Party to court for what the Supreme Court calls this rolling proclamation of states of emergencies, where the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional and void. And in response, the Attorney General Derek McCoy challenged this ruling by the Supreme Court and vowing to appeal on the Jamaica Labour Party's behalf. It's been the People's National Party's position that crime has declined through targeted law enforcement measures, which emphasizes the proof that constitutional shortcuts that violate the rights of the citizenry and the operation of a free and democratic society are not necessary. And this is the remarks of opposition leader Mark Goldie. So this active militarization of Kingston, not just in recent times, not just since 2017 when the ZOSO Act was enacted, but even within a context of a longer history of militarization and policing, has several effects. And I'll mention a couple of them briefly, but I want to emphasize one particular effect, which is what I call sensory fatigue. So the other effects include loss of income, further stigmatization and discrimination of the people that live in these zones, abuse from security officers, loss of privacy, humiliation, that is tied to physical and emotional abuse, as well as sexual predatory behavior from security officers towards residents, as communicated or as shared to me from them. So sensory fatigue, which is the primary effect that I'll be discussing today, is pardon me. So sensory fatigue is the situational cognitive interpretive as well as affective response to the layered excesses of militarization, poverty, and gang violence. So within these spaces, as they are bombarded with these different insecurities, years of policing, decades of policing, and physical and emotional abuse, but at the hands of security forces, as well as abuse or exposure to violence from inter and intra-gang warfare, as well as economic insecurity, there there is a shift in their how they experience the spaces that they live in and how they interact with each other. And sensory fatigue kind of brings to the fore how acts of witnessing, storytelling, and placemaking, refusal, and creative defiance within these communities become a decolonial and fugitive practice, and not just a symptom of trauma. It calls for us to kind of rethink how Black urban subjects navigate prolonged states of violence, abandonment, as well as trauma and sovereignty. So sensory fatigue, as it is conceptualized, was developed through three separate frameworks. And these frameworks, two of which have been developed or are by the discussions that we have today. So I look forward to their remarks on this. So the first framework is security encounters, which I came across in the work of Rivka Jaffe and Anthony Harriet. And the second is what is called fugitivity through as a method, which I saw in the work of Alex Moulton and Leslie Gross-Warden. And finally, re-existence, which as seen in the work of Adolfo Alban Echinte, Catherine Walsh, and Walter Mignolo. And I chose these frameworks because they speak to geographies that have similar post-colonial legacies and histories of Black resistance, which made them applicable to Kingston, Jamaica. So the first framework I used was security encounters. And Rivka and Anthony Harriet conceptualized security encounters as citizen interactions with security forces, often under extraordinary and violent circumstances. For them, security encounters is a political and relational process that is historically situated within longer histories of interaction between security forces and civilians. According to Harriet and Jaffe, these encounters, within these encounters, citizens, whether consciously or unconsciously, use poetics, rhetoric, bodily movement, spatial location, and objects to affirm or contest their positioning. And this is done within and beyond the encounter to negotiate the different rules, rights, responsibilities within the garrison and beyond. So for within the context of sensory fatigue, this framework explains how these same negotiations, rights, and responsibilities between the security forces and the citizenry are also subtly embedded and enacted through quotidian, everyday garrison living, where the extraordinariness of security encounters have become routinized and the affective registers of the citizens become numb to over-policing and the militarization of their homes. So I put two types of security encounters here on the slide that you'd see. And the first one would be more aligned with the type of security encounters that Jaffe and Harriet would conceptualize, where there has been a beating at the hands of the security forces and residents are confronting the security forces in an effort to get some kind of justice or reprieve for the incident. So this is on the more extreme end of a security encounter. On the opposite side, you will see a lady speaking with a security officer, and this was at a wake. This was at a wake for a community member that had passed away, and she's negotiating for more time because what's the wake, sorry, was happening within a curfew. And so it was unauthorized. It's not supposed to happen because you should be at home, so on. And she was negotiating with the police officers using her wits, using her resources that she's garnered through living through successive cycles of militarization to negotiate successfully with this officer for more time to have her the wake for her loved one. So the next framework of fugitivity as a method was, I came across it in the work of Alex and Leslie, where they understood fugitivity to be a historical phenomenon, not just an historical phenomenon, but a practice as well. A practice for apprehending, as they note, apprehending and imagining the world otherwise through three processes. That is knowledge making, kin making, and place making. So amidst scenes of violence and urban insecurity, sensory fatigue emerges as a means that enables knowledge making through the process of storytelling between elders of past homicides, and even storytelling of various security encounters that they would have experienced. And kin making is enacted through forming security networks and alliances among community members, and placemaking, which is possibly the most interesting one, as I observed it, where residents would do act that might be somewhat confusing to the onlooker. So, for example, they would be running towards the sounds of gunshots or commotions as an act of witnessing to trace escape routes, to identify perpetrators, and to delineate ever-shifting, invisible boundaries between warring factions in the community. And through these acts, they embody, or they undertake the task of placemaking within these garrison communities. So the last framework that I used was re-existence, and re-existence has been popularized by Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo to understand how sensory fatigue has enabled residents to imagine life otherwise. I looked at how Adolfo Achinte kind of wrote about re-existence in his work with Afro-Colombian populations. And in re-existence, Black subjects would imagine life otherwise that is grounded in lived experiences and memories. And re-existence here becomes a generative rather than oppositional process. And through sensory fatigue, we understand how re-existence is possible, where residents would maintain certain cultural practices even within suppressatory actions like curfews and just different regulatory acts that are meant to suppress cultural and ritualistic practices. And also, even in more subtle ways, you would see in the photograph here a young man taking a picture in front of a police car, using it as a prop for his photographs. And so they are, instead of being oppositional, sensory fatigue, just like Adolfo and Catherine and Mignolo have conceptualized, becomes a generative process where they're making life amidst these different forces that are meant to suppress and eradicate. So, as I conclude, I'd like to say that militarized urbanism in Kingston is not merely a set of policies or legacies of political violence. It is a mode of governance that renders Black life manageable through containment, disposability, and surveillance. And yet, in the shadow of these mechanisms, people continue to live, love, gather, mourn, um, and create. Sensory fatigue, as proposed, is not just exhaustion, it is a fugitive ethic, a refusal to be flattened by violence, a form of re-existence forged in the cracks of a carceral city. So, with that, thank you. And I'll now allow the respondents, the discussants, to give their remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, Tashanna. That was great. Thank you. I should have said at the start, we're recording this seminar, so we'll send the link around, or the link will be posted also on the website of the Global Centre of Healthcare and Urbanisation, which I think Jesse might put up on the chat. So we've asked Rivka and then Alex to just have a 5 minutes discussion and commentary on Tashanna's research, and do scribble any questions, your comments you have in the chat. And then Tashanna can respond to those as well as to Rivka's and Alex's thoughts. So over to you, Rivka, in Kingston.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me properly still?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to the seminar as a discussant, and also thanks for sharing the paper behind it, Tashanna. So I've had also the chance to read the written work, take on a bit the role of a peer reviewer, responding to the text as well as this presentation. But I really enjoyed the images you shared here too, though of course they're also distressing images. I want to say, first of all, congrats, also still congrats on completing and defending your thesis. But also this piece today, which connects to your thesis, it's really a fine analysis of not just these policies and legislation that we've been seeing emerging in the past 10, 15 years, but connecting these these more formal interventions to the everyday lives of citizens on the ground in Trench Town and beyond. But also connecting what's been going on in terms of policies in everyday lives to a range of theoretical, conceptual discussions in geography and beyond. So you connected to, let's say, carceral geographies, this history of the prison in the Caribbean, against the background of colonialism and enslavement. And I think we see also, or there's maybe the possibility to think with different spaces of constricted mobility or immobility. So the garrison is in itself also a type of immobility. The ghetto is the idea of the original no-go space, but ZOSO does this type of bordering too. And I think it's interesting there also to think about, with a no-go area, it goes in two ways. So there's a sense that outsiders can't come in, or the police can't come in, but also other people can't come out. And to some extent, I think gated communities also do this work of, there is a protective element like a garrison, but it's also keeping other people out. So it's also imprisoning in your own bubble in a way, in a very different way from a garrison. But I think this idea of immobilization in the context of a range of security interventions and what it does to how people feel is something that characterizes Kingston, but also other cities in a distressing, but also very particular way. So you connected to penal or carceral geographies, to longer histories of how specific spaces and populations have been treated in Jamaica and Kingston, and also to a range of postcolonial and decolonial thinkers, but also to Black geographies and ways of thinking of a Black sense of place and ideas of fugitivity that I will also defer to Alex on. I had a couple of questions maybe to probe you to speak a little more, but one thing I really like about the concept of sensory fatigue is that it connects to this interest in the embodied impact of living in a specific type of urban environment, and specifically here the sensory impact, embodied impact of long-term exposure to different types of violence and insecurity. And for me, this is also interesting because it connects to ideas of sensory urbanism. So how do people feel the city? And Alana Osborne, who you also know, who also did research in Trench Town, also has been thinking, how does the city feel? What does poverty and inequality feel like? How can you sense also danger? And I think your work really ties to this. But I was wondering if the sensory aspect could be unpacked a little more. So is it the knowledge in particular, so that people know also when a threat is there, or when certain sounds of gunshots mean one thing and not another? Or when a police presence, can you feel whether it's hostile or just a regular patrol? But I was also interested in terms of the sensory aspect. You focus on numbness, but to my mind, in the longer ethnographic descriptions in your written text, which are really very beautiful, but again also quite sad, it's not really numbness I'm seeing. So I wondered if you could speak more to, is it attunement or is it numbing, and what is the fatigue part exactly? So could you speak more to yeah, the specific embodied sensory aspect? And another type of question or interest I had is, there's of course a very long tradition in Caribbean theory across different disciplines in thinking about resistance. And definitely you can recognize this in some of the things you analyze. But I wonder also, is resistance, um, does this term, which is generally seen as kind of oppositional, does it capture what you're trying to do, which is also to move beyond just oppositional? I think on the one hand about new worlds that are also beyond resisting, but about reimagining. But also, does it capture the complex entanglement between different actors, different state actors, different types of police and military figures on the ground, but also politicians, as well as dons, as well as residents? So I think the way they're entangled historically and now, it goes beyond a simple, like, oppression from above and resistance from below. And similarly, your text, but also just now you mentioned things that, abandonment or impenetrable garrisons. But to my mind, on the ground, it's a little more complex, or it's not necessarily abandonment, but it's actually a sort of yeah, what would you call it? Adverse incorporation. So there's actually too much attention. It's not abandonment, but it's the type of attention you actually don't want. And I think people want a different type of state attention that doesn't look like a gun. And impenetrable is also for whom? I don't think actually the garrisons are impenetrable, but it depends on who you are and how you seek to quote unquote penetrate. And I very final comment before I go over my minutes. I didn't really have that much to say about dons here because they don't also feature so centrally. But one thing I've been interested in is, I don't have any sort of support from security forces per se. They're not very strong, but I have a sense that part of this militarized urbanism is a type of security policy that thinks like, oh, what dons did was effective, so let's try and mimic it. So to try and copy strategies they see dons as having developed and supporting their legitimacy, and they say, can we do that too? From curfews for children to to this idea of excessive punishment as something that people sometimes support, to organizing parties. So I wonder if you could speak to some of that, mimicking, copying of strategies that's not necessarily just anti-Don, but again, a sort of complicated relationship between security forces, electoral politics, and criminal leaders. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rivka. You can make the call, Tashanna. Do you want to respond now? We thought we might take Alex's comments and then you respond collectively. Is that what you'd like to do, or?
Yes, let's hear what Alex has to say. Yeah,
okay,
because I don't want
great.
to like overlap. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, let's zoom north from Kingston to New Jersey. So, Alex, the screen is yours.
Uh, well, I'd like to perhaps start my comments in a slightly different way. 15 years ago today, on the 26th of May, in Tivoli, the site of a lot of Tashanna's work, the Army was announcing at this point, a time roughly during the day, they were announcing that about 500 people had been detained. At around the same time, by noon, the political ombudsman would declare that his official death count was 44 civilians. That death count on the 26th of May was higher than the earlier number given by the police, which was 26. At around this time on that day, complaints from residents had started to flood into the talk show radio programs. And then later that evening, residents would be calling into television news stations to paint a picture of what was happening to outsiders. They would be telling us at this point that corpses were in the streets and the morgue was filling up. They would be telling us that food and water was running low. They'd be telling us that that thick pall of death was stalking men and boys who were being separated from families and being taken up by the police and the army on either suspicion that they were combatants or that they would be combatants in the time to come. At some point on that day, 15 years ago, the Prime Minister, who is also the Member of Parliament, would offer a kind of a tepid apology. He would say, quote, "The government deeply regrets the loss of lives, especially those of members of the security forces and innocent law-abiding citizens caught in the crossfire. The security forces were directed to take all practical steps to avoid casualties as much as possible. The embattled Prime Minister would assure the country that the agents of the state would continue to pursue, quote, criminal gunmen in whatever community they have ensconced. He would go on to say, though, that the most thorough investigation, end quote, into all the deaths would be conducted. At the same time as those declarations, journalists were being barred from entering the community as smoke emerged over the city of Kingston, still smoldering from fires that were set the previous few days. So because of this, I wonder if we can pause for a minute and think about that and think about 15 years on, still unofficial counts, still quite a number of contestations over how many people died, who were killed, and where they are now.
Thank you, Alex.
I'm not quite finished yet.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
as we think about that, I wanted for us to pause there because I think, um, 15 years ago, exactly to the day, there's something poignantly troubling and stirring about that fact. I think about Tashanna's paper in light also of the recent wave of exposure of femicide, which is not something that we typically speak about in Jamaica. We don't typically name it as such. But think about women being killed recently, including young girls, and think about that response that has emerged, certainly on social media, in response to that. The celebration of these killings by the police, of the so-called germs, of the dirty animals, end quote, and the juxtaposition in the popular discourse between civilians and the so-called human rights, which is meant to be a kind of derogatory kind of categorization of a certain group of people invested in this fanciful notion of human rights. So I begin my remarks in that way because I want to maybe highlight and call out some of the main themes that I see from Tashanna's work and some of the implications that I think are actually quite urgent. I think broadly speaking, Tashanna's work clarifies that there is still a very pervasive um, um, politics of impoverishment, a kind of post-colonial malaise that characterizes Jamaican politics today, certainly administrative politics interested in security and safety. I want to think with Tashanna's metaphor of sensory fatigue and to suggest perhaps that there is a similar kind of fatigue, but a fatigue being felt and experienced by the state, right? And their discourse seems to suggest a kind of administrative fatigue, right? The state describes crime through metaphors that paint it as a kind of miasma. I want to think about how Tashanna's work about sensory fatigue by bringing the affective into consideration might open up new ways of critiquing and understanding the state. And it's clear, or what I would say is its clear frustration with its administrative efforts and administrative fatigue. Perhaps that's a conceptualization that Tashanna can build on. Want to think too about the way that Tashanna offers us a longue durée of militarization, but want to maybe ask Tashanna what it might mean to think that longue durée a little bit further beyond the post-independence era to the very first moments in the British colonial rule, right? Jamaica comes into British colonial rule as a kind of militarized merchant colony, if not quite a kind of fiscal military state, right? And so I think that thinking that longue durée does a number of things, right? It also opens the door for the Maroons, who, in the longer version of your paper, Tashanna, you mentioned the Morant Bay Rebellion, and you mentioned how many were killed, how many were detained, and then subsequently executed. But the Maroons remain unnamed in that. And I think that within this longer durée, as we think that the role of the Maroon, the role of the West India Regiment, the role of the Black Shots might allow us to better map or to enrich our mapping of the racial and socio-political cleavages that still transect Jamaican society today, right? And also the fact that these formations of exclusion have been part and parcel of the Jamaican political reality from the beginning, right? We can think about the Maroon community as a kind of space of exclusion, and it seems to beckon for consideration alongside the ghettoized urban garrison. I'm thinking that way too, because very often, up until the last few years, the government, the administrations would frequently point to Maroon communities, right, as an example that should be followed by the urban communities. And so I think there's something there. Of course, thinking through your paper and thinking through affect, thinking through culture, I'm thinking about the vision behind Tivoli. Tivoli names both the park and pleasure garden in Copenhagen in Denmark, but also names a similar amusement park, pleasure garden, public garden in Paris, France, right? And so what are the kinds of imaginaries that were behind Tivoli, which have been laid bare by the actual politics of its existence? And I'm thinking too about how that might trouble the term ghetto area, as is used in the everyday grammar, and how it might rather insist that we say ghettoized area, which might seem like a slight semantic difference, but I think there's, important implications. And I'm thinking about that again because I'm thinking about Maroon communities, thinking about the ways in which, we have dual names for like the free villages. Right. So the official name for the free villages and then the people in those free villages had another name. How might Tivoli and the ways in which it is mapped in the popular imaginary, disrupting the kind of political cartography of Jamaica. I have three more points. One is the way you think about the ways in which the community pushes back on the curfews and so on makes me think too that these politics of encounter very importantly concern the kind of investment in the dead body, not as necessarily the scene of the spectacle of the state's violence, but also something that can be reincorporated into the community's social cultural life, right? So the kind of celebritized funeral, even the most ordinary person in Tivoli is entitled to a kind of celebrity funeral, right? The marching bands that you mentioned in the larger paper. And then to a point Rivka made, I think there's, really, really important, rich and provocative work in your research that speaks to the politics of insecurity, right? So security for some and as the flip side of insecurity for others. The same is true for mobility, immobility. Um, and I'm thinking about the moment in 2010 when the prime minister said constitutional rights do not begin at Ligani, right? And how then subsequently the signing of the extradition request in a very publicized way seems to indicate that, even if they don't necessarily begin at Ligani, they begin somewhere. So where is that site of encounter, right? And you seem to suggest that it's mobile and that race and class are rehearsed, negotiated, and contested. And then finally, one of the things I'm thinking about, having listened to your presentation, read your paper, is the way that we might think the prison, right? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, for example, suggests that the prison is not simply the singular site at which the penal apparatus gets placed, right? It's not just put down in that spot, but it's part of a carceral geography, right? Which extends beyond it, includes the multiple forms of surveillance. So I'm thinking that, and then Jovan Scott Lewis's work on the criminalization of Black repair. And I want to, maybe ask you to talk to us about the ways in which you see the Don emerging first as a attempt by the state, right, to kind of create a avenue for sufferation to be dealt with, right? So, but then now you have these unsanctioned forms of repair, right? So, to maybe some of Rivka's point, right, the way that the garrison gets constituted as this kind of political football that it's differentially penetrable, right? And maybe there's a whole lot of logic to be, the military jargon of penetration, impenetrable, and then the sexual gendered violence you talk about. Maybe that's something we can think about and connect to the point I was making about femicide. But thank you for your work in the urgent and insightful ways that it is stretching the kinds of conversations we need to be having.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex, and thank you, Rivka. Tashanna, over to you.
Thanks for those questions and those insightful remarks. So the paper that you read, actually, I just got back the reviewer comments on that. So I'm now incorporating their suggestions and the ones that you also eloquently provided here will be extremely useful as I kind of revise and rethink some of those concepts that I'm working with. And to start with Rivka's remarks about numbing and resistance. So as I conceptualize sensory fatigue, I thought about what words are present in the literature that helps to describe what I'm seeing on the ground. It's way more complex than what I was able to articulate at the time in my dissertation. As I thought about how people were able to respond to the extraordinariness of the security forces in such subtle and overt ways, like what processes or what psychological mechanisms enabled that. And so as I spoke to residents and they continuously use the words of it being a norm, it being the norm, it's normalized, it's something that they've known since childhood and something that their parents experienced and so on. It felt a lot like what the spectacle of the ZOSO or the spectacle of enhanced security measures was only spectacular to an outsider. For them, they have become so attuned to these security practices that it no longer had that effect of, kind of immediate submission or immediate response to a security officer accosting someone in handcuffs and putting them in a jeep, or suppressing them by telling them to stay in their homes, or just flashing a gun in front of a child's face. It felt a lot like a lot of these things are no longer felt the same way as it would to an outsider. And so the word numbing was the closest possible adjective I could use to describe that feeling that was being communicated to me by the residents. And in terms of resistance, it's exactly the same. As I thought about these actions of opposition, they didn't seem like full opposition, but rather something else. And re-existence was the closest thing that I found that kind of spoke to what I observed on the ground. And as the traditional framings of resistance would, especially in Black scholarship, would, or traditional Black scholarship talks about protests and these active forms of resistance with including policy shifts and so on. But then there are more subtle forms of resistance that even a lot of scholars, such as maybe Blair Kelly, who recently published on Black Joy, as a form of resistance, or not, she didn't use the word opposition, but of reclaiming what is being taken away, so to speak, from these different systematic forces that are racialized and are anti-Black. So I use re-existence because that was a part of Afro-Colombian, Afro-Latino scholarship, and I wanted something that aligned with the Caribbean experience. And so that's what emerged. Let me look at, oh, sorry, this is Alex's notes. But yes, I do 100% agree that the word resistance is something that doesn't fully capture what's happening. And even as I spoke to Javon maybe 2 years ago at the conference in Denver, Alex, in Denver, there was a seminar, a panel discussion on what resistance mean, and really taking that word out of the vocabulary when speaking about Black opposition, or this, this typology of oppression from above, as you mentioned. And so fugitivity is what I would say aligns as well with re-existence, that are both two concepts that speak to each other without being, that are complementary. So fugitivity as a method, as Alex and Leslie kind of so beautifully described in their work, isn't just about running away or escaping, but even staying in place and adapting the practices of knowledge making, kin making, and place making to reclaim what was being taken away. So those two concepts, I think, work well together to explain how sensory fatigue works within a space that has been historically under so much duress from the different forces of economic insecurity, violence at the hand of the state, as well as the gang members. Just looking here. So the impenetrable garrison, and the whole idea of the garrison as being a space of possibility for not just the state, but the people that live there, and the political, the figures of authority and power vis-a-vis the Don that live there. That's a very interesting take. And I think it's very hard to explain that, or explain the porosity of the garrison in the sensory fatigue paper. I think that's a completely different discussion altogether. And I would love to, continue that discussion as we talk about this research some more, possibly when I come to visit, and we'll have those chats. Yeah. And to move on to Alex's points of repair. So as I was writing my dissertation, I had a small section on repair and how sensory fatigue might be a type of a way, how sensory fatigue may be reparative. And I tried so hard to write it in that way after reading Javon's work, that kind of prompted me to think differently about what repair looks like in the post-colonial Caribbean within the context of, continued state violence and so on. And, eventually, Kevin was like, I'm not sure if this is the time, maybe like in a separate paper or something. And so it is something that I've actively thought about, and I do strongly believe that sensory fatigue goes beyond this idea of resistance and re-existence and numbness, and can be a form of repair for residents. And what exactly does that look like? Well, it's a work in progress. And I'll most certainly think about that. But that is kind of in line with how Black geographers are thinking about resistance. You know, like, is resistance really uh, reparative? Is it just is it resisting, or is it on this trajectory, on this path to repair? So that's kind of how I would like to conceptualize sensory fatigue as I move beyond what it currently is. Um, yeah, and again, the mobility of the garrison, the mobility of um, or how we conceptualize, or how we frame the garrison as a space that is impenetrable but also mobile, and how administrators deal with the garrison through different policies of social justice or extreme security measures and so on, is something that I would definitely think about, or I am thinking about. And the idea of administrative fatigue, I mean, that's brilliant. I love it. And not a lot of times, as I write the work that I'm writing, the work that I'm doing, I usually tend to think about the community in which I studied and the perspective of those people, and um, bringing those voices to the fore, and elevating them in scholarship. But thinking about how the states, you know, procedurally uh, conceptualizes these policies, and how they think about the garrison as maybe impenetrable, dispensable, or so on, could help to understand some of the ways in which they are militarizing it in its current form. So absolutely, Alex, I would certainly take that into consideration. And since we'll both be in New York, we can meet up and have a good chat about that. So I think that is from the kind of blurb of notes that I made. Those are the main questions I could decipher. If obviously this conversation will continue in the future, so I look forward to it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tashanna. The bells and the church towers in Oxford has been striking top of the hour, so that's perfect timing. So, um, there are no questions in the chat. If you do have a question for Tashanna, then do shout out. But we did schedule the for an hours long discussion. So, thank you so much. First to the audience for joining us online from various parts of the world. That was very kind of you to join us today. Thank you to Alex and Rivka, and I'll probably hang on the screen for a few seconds afterwards so we can have a quick chat to say thank you afterwards. But thank you again for your comments, and thank you especially to Tashanna for your seminar. And it's been a pleasure having you as a visiting researcher here in Oxford over the last well, 3 months, really, hasn't it? Well, it seems, yeah, it's about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite a good stint. So, and good luck in your new post at City College, which I'm sure will be really exciting. And it's a great college. So good. Well, I'll say adieu to the audience. Thank you very much for joining us. And if it's okay, Alex, Rivka, and also thank Jesse Weavers Medina, who's been our technical guru for the day and made sure the screen didn't blow up and has kept the show on the road. So thank you. Great. And Shireen says hello from the Dominican Republic. So thank you for joining us, Shireen. Brilliant.
Well, and
Okay,
Shireen,
right.
your point is also, this militarization. I'm sure Shoshana could speak to this too. Just recently, the Jamaican government expelled another group of Haitians back to Haiti, which is quite, contradictory given that we've been leading the charge to deal with Haiti as a failed state. So the country saying Haiti is a failed state as a neighbor is also the one sending. So I think there are obviously interesting lines of discussion and analysis there.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks to the audience. As I said, I'll loiter on screen and just thank you to Tashanna and Rivka and Alex again. But thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And I'm sure you'll hear much more from Tashanna when she's in post at City College, and also Rivka and Alex in their current and future academic endeavors. So thank you all.
Thanks for hosting, David and Jesse.
Great. Well, thanks. That's really good. Lovely to see you again, Rivka. Long time, and I certainly really enjoyed.